For today's presentation of Rochester's rich history, we're very glad to be welcoming Jim Farrington and the Reverend Stephen Cady from Asbury First United Methodist Church. The church has been a member of Rochester's community for 200 years this weekend, and we're so glad we're able to help them in celebrating this milestone event. Mr. Farrington is head of the Bicentennial Archive Project for the church, along with being head of public services at the Sibley Music Library, the Eastman School of Music. While Stephen Cady is senior minister at Asbury First United Methodist Church. He's served churches in Chicago, New Jersey, and New York, and holds a PhD from Princeton Seminary. Gentlemen, turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much. And, it's funny how things work that I ran into Brandon when I was doing some research for our bicentennial as we were beginning this year, that there was this passing reference in our archives to someone by the name of Samson Wood, who was described as the only African-American in Rochester at the time of our founding. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. We would have had 100% integration at the time if that happened to be true. But what we discovered was that it wasn't true. And I think that says something about just the way we view race. And as we're discussing right now in Rochester and in the national conversation, I think it's an important thing to just recognize. So I just want to say thank you to Brandon for inviting us. Thanks for having us. And I also want to say a special thank you to Jim, who is an example of how the church got to be 200 years old. And it is.
I'm not that old.
He wasn't there right at the very beginning, but Jim is an example of someone who has given of his time and effort and energy to make the church as good as it is today and as strong as it is today. For 2 years, he has come in weekly and gone through our archives, which I don't know if any of you know what it's like after 200 years of institutional living. Just the archives get piled upon, piled upon. We didn't know what we had back there. And with another member of the congregation, he tirelessly came and worked and went hours by hour just going through everything we had, documenting what we had. And as a result, we're able to tell the story in a much richer, much fuller way. So I want to say a special thank you to Jim for that. So our hope today is to tell part of the story. As you heard Brandon share that tomorrow is our actual bicentennial. So literally tomorrow, we will be 200 years old. It was a Wednesday, September 20th, 1820. We feel lucky as a church that it is a Sunday landing this year that we can celebrate it together in that way. One challenge, of course, for us is that we had all these high hopes and big plans for what the bicentennial would look like for us as a church. And all of those had to be put on hold as we face the much more pressing issues of our society right now, and especially the global pandemic. So we found our way through, and we're happy to share what we can and share part of the story today. So and as always, and I recognize that some of the people on this call may have a lot of familiarity with what Methodism looks like, what Asbury First looks like. Maybe there are some members here, and a lot of people won't. So I thought I might just start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. But then I just might share a little bit about how did Methodism kind of get started in the United States. I won't dwell there, but I do think it's important because our name, Asbury First, is taken from one of the founders of Methodism in the nascent United States. So Francis Asbury may be a name that some know and others don't. But Francis Asbury was born, of course, in England, and he found his way to the United States, or first to the colonies, and then stayed while it was the United States. He was sent by John Wesley, who was the founder of Methodism. One of the unique parts about Methodism was that it was founded always on the notion that we had to try to find a way to bridge vital piety and social holiness. So the way that I would think about that is the inward part of our faith with the outward part of our faith. So trying to figure out, yes, it's great to sort of build the soul, but if you're not doing anything with it, then what does it matter? And so trying to find a way to balance that which we take in and all of the stuff that we do, to the Bible study, the prayer, the enrichment of the soul, and then to try and balance that with what comes out. So the care of the poor, the sick, the imprisoned, that's been at the heart of Methodism from the beginning. And in some ways it makes sense because it was a response 200 years later to sort of the pendulum swinging too far after the Protestant Reformation. I digress a little bit, but it makes a little sense of how we got to be. So John Wesley had some struggles in the colonies himself. Just after he had graduated from Oxford, he and his brother came over to Savannah, Georgia, and he fell in love with a woman who didn't love him back, and he refused to give her communion, and he was run out of town, sent back over on a ship to England, never to step foot in the American colonies again. So when it came time to send some Methodists over, John Wesley knew he couldn't go himself, and so he sent a few preachers, Francis Asbury being one of them, and he was prolific. They say that when Francis Asbury landed in the American colonies in 1771, there were about 600 people total that would claim to be connected with the Methodist movement, and they were mostly focused in cities. In some of the big cities, we're talking Philadelphia, New York, Boston, those areas. By the time of his death in 1860, there were over 200,000 that claimed Methodism, and in large part due to the work of Francis Asbury. He never found a home in the United States. Instead, he traveled his whole life on horseback. They said that he rode never less than 2,000 miles a year, but typically around 6,000 miles a year, so that throughout his career in the United States over 40 years, he traveled over 130,000 miles, all on horseback. They said that when he died, he was better known by face than any other American at the time, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. We don't have any records of him actually coming up to the Genesee Valley, though we have plenty of records of him being in the Alleghenies and in other places that would have been close. He may very well have. What we do have a record of is that at one point, he sent some circuit riders. Those are those who would go on horseback. How Methodism worked was that they would set up these small groups. They called them class meetings, and these class meetings would meet. They'd have a very particular agenda, but it'd be for prayer and singing, and they would always start with the same question: how is it with your soul? And so they would set up these small groups, and what Francis Asbury did, and modeling after what had happened in England, though on a much larger scale, is he would set up these circuits, these routes that ministers that he would kind of train and send out would travel, and they would be anywhere from 200 to 600 mile routes, and they would go through and touch base with each of those class meetings once a quarter. So they'd be on a really big route going by horseback from meeting to meeting to meeting. To be able to care for the people. We know that he sent at one point some people up into the Genesee Valley to try and set up a class meeting. We don't know how well it went, but we know that for at least 2 years, there was a group that gathered in the swamp marshlands of what was then Rochesterville. And it was a town at that time about 700 people, and there was a group of 30 that met, and they met originally in a schoolhouse on Fitzhugh Street. And we know for that at least a couple of years they began to meet. And Jim's going to show you some of the. We have Francis Asbury's signature on this, which is pretty cool. You want to say anything about it?
Sure. This is just it's one of the things that was discovered in the archive as just more curiosity. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with our church or anything, but a Francis Asbury signature is a fairly collectible thing if you're into collecting. This one happens to be somebody where he is making somebody a deacon, an Asa Patty, who I've not yet been able to find. I found a couple of Asa Patties in Massachusetts, one of whom was a Baptist, and the other one, I'm not sure that it matches this particular one. So one more thing for the historians to find is who what the story is behind this. But that's just a particularly fun document that we have in the archive.
It's pretty remarkable, and that which Asbury, what is signed by Asbury is unique because he had very few possessions upon his death. And one of the, I think, a fascinating story is that when he died, he left what he had, which were some old books, his horse, and a leather carrying case, to the current bishop of the Methodist Church. And there's a story that they asked a young minister to carry it on horseback across the Alleghenies. And at one point they were set upon by bandits, thinking that it was a money drop, because it was the same kind of leather satchel apparently that used to carry things for the Pony Express. And so these bandits set upon him, and they said, "Give us the silver that you had," to which the minister responded, "I don't have any silver. All that I have here are the possessions of the late Francis Asbury." And the bandit stopped and looked at it. One of the bandits stopped and looked at him and said, "You mean Bishop Asbury is dead? He used to come to my house and preach." And he left them alone. These great stories. Now, obviously the preaching didn't work, but that's the way it goes. Story of my life. So one of the interesting things is that this little group that was this class meeting of 30 people that was meeting on Fitzhugh Street in the schoolhouse, they were said to really attract people by the music that they sang. And I like to think it's the preaching, but it still isn't the case. It's mostly the music that brings people to church. So it was the same back then. At some point, they decided to incorporate, and they did so on September 20th, 1820, which, as I said, was a Wednesday, but tomorrow, the 200th, is a Sunday. And it was touch and go for quite some time. Over the course of the next 5 years, they had a different minister every year, and they struggled with how to find their way. And they didn't grow very much, but I think by 1825, they had finally decided it was time to erect a building. And so they found their way into a place which is actually, their first chapel was built on the location where it was on the east side of the river, where the convention center sits today. And it was during that time that they got a young minister named John Dempster. He was the first minister to stay for longer than 1 year. He stayed for 2. So not a whole lot of time, but he stayed. And one of the unique things that he did was, and partially I think we can give him credit, but I think the completion of the Erie Canal would have likely helped this as well. But John Dempster is unique in the history of Methodism in that he went on to found the first ever schools of theology in the Methodist Church. So he helped form Boston University and Northwestern University and Garrett Biblical Institute, which today is Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, where I happen to go. So he's a unique person, John Dempster. And my daughter was born in Chicago when we were serving there. She was born on Dempster Avenue. So I just think it's a unique connection where we are. But Dempster was known to be a really good preacher and good at bringing people in. And in that time, like I said, the Erie Canal likely helped, but the church grew from 50 to 400 in his 2 years there. So quadrupled in size, or more than that, right? It increased dramatically, so much so that that chapel that they built no longer fit them. So they began a search for a new building. And in 1831, as Jim's showing you on the corner of Fitzhugh and Buffalo, which is now West Main, they began to build a new church. And like most Methodists still do today, they decided the best way to do that was by committee. And so they got people together, and they, instead of hiring an architect, they instead allowed the church to be built by committee. So everybody had their say. So when it was finally completed in 1831, one of the accounts that we have was that it was a beautiful structure with, quote, mixed architecture. It couldn't quite decide what it actually was, but it was a big stone building that was reported to be able to hold 2,000 people, a huge building. They had big sites. There are sites set on big growth. At that time, they found some growth. The camp meeting movement was happening. If those who know a little bit about Rochester being known at some points as the burnt over district, that meant not because there was a fire, but because of the catching of the Holy Spirit, and preachers no longer wanted to come in this area because all the souls had been saved. So it was completely burnt over. But there was one minister at the time named Glezzen Fillmore, who was the brother of Millard Fillmore, the president, and who was known for his big booming voice. And they said that he could preach and be heard a mile away against the wind. So there are funny stories about him and just this portly gentleman that had a huge voice and brought many people into the congregation at the time. So at the time, things were starting to look up for that young First Church. It was incorporated as First Methodist Episcopal Church in the village of Rochester. That was its name, First Church. So things were looking up for First Church until tragedy struck in 1835. The church that was of mixed architecture burned down. January 4th, 1835, the building caught on fire and it burned completely. It was completely lost. And at the time, they had absolutely no insurance and they were already in debt. Part of the way that they built the church was by taking on debt as a congregation. Not a good practice at the time. And they say, there's some accounts that say that at the time of the fire, the building itself was $40,000 and the debt was $21,000 on top of that. So in those times, those would have been astronomical numbers, unbelievable. They were able to go across the river, so to the east side of the church, because if you know, Fitzhugh and Main is on the west side. So they borrowed a chapel for a little while and again formed a committee to try and figure out what to do. And there started to be great tension in the church. Some people wanted to split the church in two, just to go into two smaller congregations. Some people wanted to stay at one and just find a new location for a church. And others wanted to stay and rebuild. And as soon as the rubble was pulled away, some people did just that. That is, they refused to worship in that other chapel that was nicely being loaned to them. And so they started worshiping every Sunday morning in that burnt out husk of the old building. Some people don't like change. And started to build the church around them, stone by stone, to try and make it work and pull it back together. And that is actually how two churches were formed. So on the west side, that was the church that had started to meet in that borrowed chapel. It was incorporated on September 26th, 1836. It was incorporated as the first way it was incorporated. Sorry, hold on one second. I'm losing track of myself here. That's what would eventually become Asbury, but it was became St. John's, and before that it was the East Society. Sorry,
East Society.
Yeah. So it was called the East Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church in the village of Rochester. So the East Society eventually became St. John's, which eventually became Asbury. And so they were two churches. And on the west side, First Church slowly rebuilt itself and brick by brick tried to build the same church that they had once again. Now the challenge was that they still didn't have any money. Neither side had any money. And over on the east side, the East Society began, they met for 2 years in actually the stable behind an inn. And they put a roof over the stable because there was no room for them in the inn. And they found their way. And they literally called it the hole in the wall. So it was the church in the hole in the wall at the time. And they had fun with that and eventually found a way to build their own church. And they built a church on the east side of the city, piece by piece. The other side, on the west side of the river, where you still had First Church, they needed to build their building. They needed to build a new building. Well, I should say, they needed a building. They built this building where they were in, but they couldn't afford it. Both sides got into a really strange way of raising money, which was a stock option. So what they would do is they would sell stock in the church. So every member would be asked to buy stock in the church. And the idea was that it would pay dividends once they finally built a new church or finished their church, whatever it was that they were doing at the time. And they would get dividends off of the pew rentals. So some will remember that, well, not remember literally, but you may remember from the actual reading or something about it. But, back in the day, the way that churches managed their budgets was by charging fees for the pews, which was how later on the Free Methodists would be formed, because you can hear in that they didn't think you ought to pay money to have to go to church. We other Methodists hadn't figured it out quite yet, but they sold stock. And the challenge with that, of course, was when the church couldn't pay their stockholders, and everybody had invested in it, which meant that everyone suffered. First Church struggled so much that they had to sell their building. And they didn't want to, but they had to sell their building and, to relieve some of the debt, but not all of the debt. And their stockholders were upset. At what would be St. John's eventually that they built, they had it even worse, which was that they had their building foreclosed upon. So in fact, in the moment, members lost their farms, they lost their homes because they had invested in the stock, and they were officially owners of this property. So they couldn't afford it, and the city foreclosed. And luckily for them, at the last minute, it was actually an auction, but one of the members, Hiram Davis, he managed to sell some real estate and to borrow money so that in the moment he could buy the church back on the actual day of the auction. It's a pretty remarkable moment so that his church could continue to meet.
He bought it for $6,000, right?
Yeah, $6,000 or $7,000. It was some remarkable amount. And he stayed with the church the rest of his life. And you think, yeah, that takes some investment. I sort of joke that all we ask right now is for people to make a pledge. And here people were selling their farms and their houses and losing their shirts off their back in order to bring the church together. So you have to imagine that it's not just that the church is existing in a vacuum at this point. So much is going on within the world and in Rochester. From the depression of the late 1840s and 1830s to the saber rattling as we get towards the Civil War. Over the next several years, there were other churches built. So once Asbury First Church built another church in 1856 and 1861, they eventually pulled it together. One of the First Church, all of the records sort of stopped for about 10 years. And they think that there was so much infighting at the time that they stopped putting annual reports out. There was no reports to the trustees. But eventually they somehow made amends enough to build a new church that's on the corner of Fitzhugh, just further up Fitzhugh Street. And you can see in the picture that Jim is putting out, this was the church that was built. It lasted for another 40 years where they worshiped in it. It was jokingly called the Heavenly Toothpick at one point because there was a special spire in it that they joked about. And in fact, they worried that it was going to be struck by lightning. And there was a church across the street, I think it was a Baptist or a Presbyterian church, that was struck by lightning. And it was later in 1890s eventually struck by lightning, but only after they had begun working behind it to build a new structure. On the other side, Asbury eventually found their way and began to build their own building, a new one out of the wreckage. So they were able to hold on to this building that Hiram Davis had saved for them and eventually take some ownership over it on their own. Interesting ways of trying to make money at the time. The women of the church started taking on contracts from the city. And the city contracts were so that they could build they would construct uniforms for soldiers and for police officers and for firefighters. And they would sell them to the city, and all the money would go to help pay off and ease the debts of the church at the time. I think it's really interesting to note some of the things that the church really cared about. I mean, you think about during the Civil War, the church was caring for soldiers and especially widows who were doing what they could to care for the widow that was left in their land. They would spend time at church rolling bandages so that they could care for the wounded soldiers. And there's even a funny story about, funny today, not funny then, I'm sure, of holding a funeral service for somebody that they were sure was dead, and then coming back and having him show up just afterwards and say, by the way, I'm here. Just some interesting stuff. You can see some of the pictures that are being shown. So that was the Heavenly Toothpick, and the next one that Jim was showing is I believe of Asbury at the time. There's First. So they eventually got their
This was the one that replaced the toothpick.
Yeah, the heavenly toothpick. One of the interesting parts is that, so yeah, they had the hole in the wall and the heavenly toothpick on the other side. There are the things that they cared about. There's a records of, there's a long period of time in the 19th century in which musical instrumentation was frowned upon. So you could have singing, and if you remember back to the beginning, the singing was something that attracted so many people to the church, and they would come, and we always had singing to my knowledge, but there's a record that says they were finally allowed to have instrumentation again. And there was this whole movement in American Protestantism that denied the use of any kind of instrumentation and was it seriously frowned upon any kind of use of it. Truth be told, I'm not sure, I can't think of theologically why that would be the case, but I don't understand theologically a lot of the things that happened in the 19th century, nor in the 20th or 21st, frankly, for that matter, but we find our way. One of the interesting parts is that there's a story about one of the ministers overhearing a bass violin being tuned in the building of one of the churches and getting so angry that he marched out and left. So just the kinds of things that people really care about. One of the other funny things is to us today was that in 1889, and I'm giving Jim a lot of credit because I've been looking at this book of sermons, but it didn't have, it was a photocopy and it didn't actually have the name of the minister who did them, but the name is the Reverend Dr. Benham, who in 1889 published this book of sermons about the biggest challenge facing Rochester of the day, the biggest social ill, which was, of course, dancing. And there is, if you're just reading through it, it's almost hilarious reading the kinds of things that he says within these sermons about dancing. And I think there's a big irony for us at Asbury First, because in the 1940s, we started hosting dances, which was how so many of our current membership met each other. In fact, our longest member of the church, he's been here his entire life. He's 95 years old. He met his wife at a dance at Asbury First. And I just think it is very unique that just 50 years before, there was a minister shouting about the evils of dancing. And so it's funny reading back through the archives, kind of seeing how sensibilities shift and how things change over time. So by the late 19th century and the early 20th century, both churches were starting to be on more solid footing. You'll recognize that one of the unique contributions of Rochester to the theological world was the movement called the social gospel. And some will know the name Walter Rauschenbusch, who is not affiliated with Asbury First in any way, but who was a student at Colgate Divinity School. And as a result of that, when he went down to, after he left and he went down to become a minister in New York, he saw the abhorrent working conditions of some of the immigrants and especially of children, and he began to speak out about it. And he kind of recognized that if we're going to practice our faith, it has to be a faith that we're going to speak out about the social evils of the time. And the Methodist Church was the first to adopt a social creed as a result of some of that work. And you can see it at work within Asbury First as they begin to recognize some of the plight of the poor and the hungry within Rochester, trying to figure out how do we not become a city on a hill so far removed from everybody, but become a light a light on a hill that's to shine light and to help see what it is that's going on in the world. So I think you see a lot of that at play and at work in the church at the time. So Asbury on the east side of the river buys a plot of land from the Baptists at 321 East Avenue. And that church, and at first they worship in the chapel that the Baptists had, and dedicating that new space was James Bashford, who's important to me because he was the president at the time of Ohio Wesleyan University, which is my alma mater, the greatest school in the United States, but I digress. So he came and helped dedicate that space. He later became a bishop in the Methodist Church. Eventually, though, they tore down the Baptist chapel, and they built what's there today, which is has become Bethel New Life, which is there, and that's where Asbury existed since the late 19th century. So there was in the cornerstone, on the other side, First Methodist was also building a church at the time around between the late 1800s, so about 1900. Oh, it's on the screen. Yeah, 1900. They were able to dedicate the space. And one of the things that was fascinating about that was there was a woman who wrote a letter to posterity in the cornerstone. And the letter is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and if we have time later, maybe I'll read it for you. I have a copy of it here. It's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and it's just about how it's written in general to posterity, and she's really talking about men. And she's saying, eventually we'll have figured this all out, that no longer will we have to be fundraising, no longer will women be expected to do X, Y, and Z. It's a really fascinating just look and glimpse into what was going on, even in the social churches of the church at the time, to try and recognize the role of women. And at the sort of middle of the women's suffrage movement, it wouldn't be another 20 years before women got the right to vote. So fascinating just to look at some of that, and why they put it into the cornerstone of the church must have said something about what they cared about and what they were trying to do in the world. First Church had its own building, and Asbury had its own building. At the early part of the 20th century, they were both doing okay. I mean, after struggling for so long during the 19th century, they were finally starting to make headway. First Church was much smaller, I should say maybe 2/3 of the size of Asbury. First Church was 2/3 the size of Asbury. One thing that I neglected to share, and that I think is important to note, that even in the 1840s and 1850s, when they were struggling as congregations, they worked to found at least 3 other congregations at the time. So
I think it was 4.
Well, 4 including Asbury. So Cobb, maybe we can.
Right.
I was including Asbury in that. They were both starting, but it doesn't matter. 4 or 5 other congregations that they were able to form. So they were called at the time Frank Street, Cobb's Hill, and what was the third one?
It was North Street, Cornhill, Alexander Street, and Frank Street. Those are the ones that I have.
Okay, yeah. So those 4 plus Asbury, and some of them exist to this day, not in the same form. They would be the sort of grandparents of the churches that exist today. Covenant United Methodist would be an example of one of them, as well as what is today called New Horizons, but is a combination of Grace and West Avenue, which were taken off from Frank Street and and some of the others. So it's just kind of interesting to see how even when things were really rough, they would take 100 people from their membership and fund them to go start a new congregation. I think it says something about that kind of ecumenical spirit at the time, and that they cared about the mission as they were carrying forward. Okay, so we left them as the early part of the 20th century. The 1901 church was located on Fitzhugh Street, I think just further up. So almost all of the First Church churches were located somewhere on Fitzhugh Street and near Main. So all of those areas, and they would move across the street or up the street a little bit, but it was almost always on Fitzhugh Street, so on the west side. So you really think, and I think it's important to note how easy it is for us to get from the east side of Rochester to the west side of Rochester. But certainly in the early 19th century, that wouldn't have been the case. There may have been bridges to be able to get across, but I'm not sure how easily they could do that. So it did kind of matter where these churches were located. So everything was kind of going swimmingly until there was another fire. So I'll just back up. At 100 years ago, the centennial for First Church, I think it's funny that I learned this week that the guest speaker for the centennial service didn't show up. They think that maybe his train was subject to a strike from the rail workers, or that he got ill. They don't know. But right at the last minute that morning, they discovered that he wasn't going to be able to be there. So they called Rush Rees, who was the then president of the University of Rochester, who came and gave an impromptu sermon. They had a big event that night thinking that their guest preacher was going to be there. And again, he wasn't able to, he didn't show up. So then the minister at the time, Dr. Ogden, preached impromptu, and that was his last year at the church. I don't know if they're connected, but I do think it's interesting. So there was a huge fire, a 4-alarm fire that absolutely destroyed the church. This was in 1933, and it happened in June. I think it was June 3rd or May. Maybe May.
It was May.
May 3rd of 1933 that that the church was destroyed. It was a 4-alarm fire, and as you can see from the pictures, it was absolutely devastating. Firefighters worked, and many were injured actually in the blaze, and nobody died to my knowledge, but the church was completely lost.
If I can interject, so this picture right here in the upper right corner is really, I think, one of the more striking photographs we have in the collection. We've got tens of thousands of photographs, not all of the fire, but we do have many of the fire, and this one in particular has always struck me because right here you can see in the middle. So here's our poor church burning. Over here's Kodak Tower, and right through this little hole in the smoke, you can see, what did we say it was, St. Peter's? Brandon, do you remember?
St. Patrick's.
St. Patrick's, you're right. It's St. Patrick's steeple right there in the middle. So it makes for a very dramatic photograph.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And the pictures are absolutely devastating from this.
Yeah, here's interior pictures showing, the aftermath of what happened. You can see from the interior, I mean, it's just a complete shambles.
Yeah, some of these are so striking. So Asbury was at that point at where the Bethel Christian Fellowship is, and First Church burnt down. And then they were faced with another moment where they had to make a hard choice. Now, the good news is, unlike the fire from 98 years earlier, they had insurance, which meant that they were able, if they wanted to rebuild. But I think they were faced with kind of an existential choice at that point. Here they were on the west side of the river, and Asbury was over on the east side of the river. And they had to figure out, is it worthwhile? There are other churches that we've helped to form over here. Is it worthwhile for us to build a new church, to take the insurance money that we've gotten and the assets that we have left in real estate, things like their parsonages and those kinds of things, which, if you don't know that word, it's where ministers live typically, or especially at the time. Do they take their assets and just rebuild, or do they think about joining with another church? Back in the day, they had tried to join back with Asbury, and the offer was rejected. And this was back in the mid-19th century, about 30 years after they had originally gotten together. But instead, they pulled together, in, again, true Methodist fashion, a committee to try and think about what it was that they were going to do. And they made the decision that they were going to rejoin with Asbury to become Asbury First Methodist Church. Thank you. So they would rejoin to become the Asbury First Methodist Church. I think one of the most fascinating things, and I think a true sign of the spirit that I still feel within this congregation, was they decided, and remarkably in my mind, to take their assets and split them in half. And roughly half went to go support the Asbury congregation, where they were getting ready to join and have this big influx of new members coming in. And the other half, which at the time was about $75,000, it was in the middle of the Depression, they decided to share, to give away to other congregations that might need it. I think just remembering what it was like to be in debt, remembering what it was like to struggle, they gave it away. And I think there's something remarkable about that and surprising about that. So Asbury First became Asbury First, a reunion after 98 years in 1934. And Weldon Crosland was the minister. He was a young man who had come from Nebraska Wesleyan University, and he found his way through Michigan and then through to Asbury at the time. And then shortly after he took over, they had the opportunity to join with First. And suddenly he had this big congregation that he wanted to figure out what to do with. And immediately he had this vision for a big cathedral church, what he called an edifice. I don't really love that term, but he called it an edifice. And so they began searching for a place to be able to build this church. And eventually they found a plot of land in down the street on East Avenue at 10. First, it was at 1010 East Avenue. There was a meeting house that they bought, and that's still exists today. In fact, it's where we are trying to convert right now into an outreach center. So we still have that building, though the idea when we bought it was that it would quickly be torn down so that we could expand the church. But he was also able to build 1070, to buy 1070. And then eventually 1050 East Avenue, which is where I'm sitting today.
This one is 1070 right here, which was ultimately torn down. And there is 1050 where Stephen now sits.
Yeah, so where I sit right now, we actually bought 1050 from the city for $7,000, which in the 1940s was unbelievable, even then. And that was just the back taxes. It was it was starting to be run down. They weren't paying taxes on it, and so we were able to purchase it. The building that I'm sitting in right now is actually was owned at one point by George Eastman for 11 years. He lived here with his mother while this was his starter home, I suppose, while he was building the Eastman house just down the street. But regarding the church building itself, it took Weldon Crosland over 2 decades to get the building built that he had envisioned. When they bought 1070, they were able to raise it because it was in a unsalvageable position and to begin plans for a building. Now he had these huge plans and just life kept creeping up. One example was that they took a vote to build the building and to start the campaign. And then 6 days later, Pearl Harbor happened. So I think part of it is being able to respond to the circumstances of the time, sort of like planning a bicentennial and then a pandemic, right? You just have these things that come up, and you have to, as a church, find a way, and as human beings, find a way to be resilient. Weldon Crosland, you see him here, he had this huge vision for what this church would be. In fact, if those of you who know Asbury First steeple know that it's this tall spire. He had originally envisioned it something like double the size it is currently. He had envisioned, and Jim will show you the plans here in a moment, but he had this vision of actually, 2 bowling alleys and chapels and all sorts of stuff that ultimately, this vision much larger than what it actually is today, though I think it's plenty large at the time.
This area right here is where 1070 sits today, and they envisioned having this, an entire area. On this next screen, you can see this was so here's the sanctuary where it sits today, and look at the size of this community house that they had. They were going to have gardens, a second chapel, a little bit of parking in the back. And then this is the floor plan for it. So again, you can see this is the original sanctuary, which we largely, I think the footprint of this is largely the same. But then there was all the rest of this that they had planned to build onto, which they just didn't have the money for it.
Yeah, so all of it was trying to figure out how to build this building through the Depression, through World War II, and then eventually they managed to do it. And one of the first pictures that you saw Jim show was of the cornerstone, which was unique in that Weldon Crosland had this vision that he was going to get the cornerstone with the stones from the quarry of the Temple of Solomon. So he had gone to Israel several years before, and they think they had identified the quarry where the stones were taken to build the temple. And so he arranged for a purchase. He paid for it himself, and he had that brought, and it sits currently as the cornerstone of Asbury First United Methodist Church. So it's very unique. It was hollowed out. It's actually a time capsule, so there's stuff inside of it. We have a list of, I think, of what the stuff is, but I don't know off the top of my head. But it's pretty remarkable to think about. Now, I think most of us should look on somewhat skeptically of how they could tell if the quarry was actually the quarry for the Temple of Solomon. But regardless, it's still
a good story,
and it's a very cool idea. Very cool story. So the church was built, and I think there's some interesting things. The way that the church was built, the largest donation came from someone who was not a member of the congregation, but instead Mrs. Dake, her husband, had been listening to the service on the radio and found it very meaningful. And when he died, she looked for some place to hold the service, and there were places that, because he wasn't a member of any church, wouldn't hold the service for him. And Weldon Crosland agreed to hold the service and refused to take payment for it. And so she decided that she was going to leave her money, she died a year later, to the church, in the hope that they would be able to build this building, this chapel. And it was her donation, which was, I think, $300,000, $350,000, a huge amount, especially in 1940s money, that helped make it possible. Another large chunk came from the Watson family of IBM fame. That I think it's, I don't want to tell his name. I'll get it wrong because that's not history I know. But the founder of IBM was down in New York City, and his parents were members of the church, and they reached out to him, and Weldon Crosland went down and had a meeting with him and came back with enough money to build a certain section of the church, and eventually to do the carillon, the singing tower for the church. But as you see throughout the building itself, we had to kind of value engineer, and the original vision was one thing, and then we had to, when it came time, find a way to do what we could. And I think that has been the case, certainly in my time here, but it's been the case of, I think, everybody throughout that we've been able to do this. Asbury First held the sort of convocation for the World Council of Churches in the 1950s. We had people here. It was hosted by Colgate Rochester Divinity School at the time, but it was, we held the big formal service, which was pretty neat. To be able to host that here. There's great pictures of that moment taking place at the church. I think over the years, Asbury First has become known for its social outreach at the time, though, as I hope I pointed out, you can see some of that throughout our entire history as a congregation. But we started the storehouse, which today serves about 6,000 unique families each year of clothing. That started in 1965 when somebody came looking for a pair of pants. And a woman at the church said, well, if her name was Nita Finley, she said, if he needs a pair of pants, I bet others need a pair of pants as well. And so they began to take over a closet and eventually expanded. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, it became a rallying place for opposition to the war in Vietnam. This is where buses would meet and leave from to go down. In 1991, we opened the Dining and Caring Center, which today serves about 35,000 meals a year. We offer hair care, laundry, and shower facilities right here on our campus in one of those buildings. In the early 2000s, it was here from this pulpit that sermons were preached. There's a whole book of sermons opposing the war in Iraq. And we have later in 2009, a clinic, a medical clinic, which was a unique partnership with the University of Rochester that opened up on our campus. And that brings us in some ways to today. Now I've sort of quickly rushed through the last little bits of this history, trying to preserve the time that I was allotted. But I hope that you've gotten some sense of who we are. I think the exciting part for me is that we're still alive and thriving congregation. I do think there's some irony in the fact that we will have less than 30 people in our sanctuary tomorrow, and that 200 years ago there was 30, but there will be people watching on the live stream, and you're all invited to do so as well. But Jim, do you have anything that you wanted to add that I missed? Or
the other thing, let me see if I can get back to it. So as Stephen said, I've been doing this for a couple of years now, going through the archives. What is remarkable to me as a professional archivist and librarian is simply the fact that we still have all of this stuff. We've gone through countless fires and gone through all these different moves and all of these splits and rejoinders and everything else, and yet we still have material. And if I can get back to it, one of my first slides was actually our founding documents. We actually have the meeting notes from that September 1820 meeting. Let's see. Come on. Pictures tend to slow this thing down. But anyways, that to me is one of the most remarkable things, just simply how rich and detailed the archives are. I mean, yeah, I've been at this for a couple of years. It's going to take, I mean, and that's just simply inventorying things. And that's just simply inventorying what's in there that has nothing to do with the real cataloging and all these hundreds, thousands of pictures that we have, and identifying people. Some pictures have names on the back, some pictures we have no idea what the pictures of. So we've got lots and lots and lots of work ahead of us in that regard.
We'd be happy to take questions if people are still awake, and if not, we understand that as well.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen, for speaking today. Really appreciate it. I'm going to unmute everyone at this point, and anyone please jump in with questions. We'd appreciate
it. So I'm Jerry Szymanski. I work with Jim, but I have a bit of a connection to Asbury. I've had some of my music performed there over the years. And when I heard the name Dempster, I knew of Doug Dempster, who was connected to Eastman and is connected to your church. Are they any relation?
That's a great question. I don't know.
I mean,
I don't know. Do you know if he has family from here? I didn't think Doug was from here.
But if that minister was only around for a couple of years, way back when,
yeah,
I just didn't know if it's like, wow, that's kind of a unique name, and then to know somebody who's involved in your church with that name now, as well as way in the past. So, all right, that's cool.
A very good question.
See what you can find out.
Yeah.
So I have a quick question. I was intrigued by your comment about not having, instruments in the worship in the early days of the church. Do we know when they were finally starting to allow at least a piano or an organ or something?
So there's a reference to it in the sort of story in the history archives of the church that puts it somewhere in the late I'm guessing somewhat on this, right around like 1870, around there, but it could be give or take a decade in that time. But it's interesting, and at some point, if I had more time, I would go through and try and figure out sort of where all of that came from. I know some of it from, even for the Protestant Reformation, there was some shortly afterwards, there was some pushback against instrumentation, but that's certainly not my area.
Thank you.
I just want to thank you for this. I grew up at Asbury and was married there. And sorry to say, I wandered down the street to Third Presbyterian, but I still hold Asbury in my heart and have a lot of friends from there. So.
Wonderful. Well, we don't want to take away any Presbyterians, just glad to make the connection.
Yeah, when you showed the picture, I guess it was dedicating the church before it was built, and I recognized Austin Truitt, our choir director, there in front. So, of course, you wouldn't have known him, but
yes,
it was fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like I said, there's all these pictures, and a lot of them just are not. We don't know who a lot of people are. So one of the things that I've always wanted to do was to get some of these pictures out into the hands of people who've been around the church for many decades, to potentially identify some of the people that we see. And it's just, and not just our pictures, but think of pictures, and of course Rochester Public Library has tens of thousands of pictures as well, and so many of them are unidentified, and they're lost to time, maybe of somebody, of importance, or somebody that as a family member who wants to, but we can't make that connection until some of these things are identified.
I know that the University of Rochester will often photograph or post a photograph in their alumni newsletter and say, who are these people? Like, they post one like every couple issues, and a lot of people will write in, and they print those letters or emails that say, oh, that's blah blah blah, and that was the hockey game in 1971. I can tell you at the LGBT Center, what we've done with our photo collection is we've actually had like little parties where we invite people to come in, and we spread the photographs on the table, and folks say, oh, that's blah blah blah, that's blah blah blah, and then we put Post-it or write in pencil on a little piece of paper that accompanies it, not on the photo itself, but it's made a really big dent in all of these unknowable pictures. I think it would be really worth it if you have a bunch of folks. I mean, that fellow that you mentioned that's 94 years old, just take a bunch over to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's been very helpful too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because back in the day, everyone knew who that was. You didn't need to write the name of that person on the picture, because everybody knew who that was, and now nobody does.
Yeah.
There was a question that came up about Asbury's connection to the Underground Railroad or abolition, and so I don't have a great answer for you on that. Trust me, that's something I would love to see. One of the things that we have done in sort of response to the current moment is committed to undertaking what we're calling a racial audit of the church, and sort of looking at how have we failed or succeeded in meeting the demands for racial justice in the time. But I don't have a great answer. What I do know is that one of the people that I named earlier, John Dempster, as he sort of grew in theological significance, became, so Methodists early on were opposed to slavery. So we have been opposed to slavery from, since early on. And I would say that making note in our archives that Samson Wood, as some of you may have joined late, Samson Wood was a member of the church of that original 30. They described him as the only African-American living in Rochester at the time. As when I met Brandon, I was doing research to try and figure out whether that was true. It's not, but that says something in and of itself. But nonetheless, the church would have had somebody there. What I was going to say is that John Dempster, he went on, and there's a great story about him being the main organizing force behind a group of clergy that went to meet with President Lincoln to push for the Emancipation Proclamation. And I think that's unique. And while we can't claim that directly, obviously, nor do I think we've always been perfect in those areas, I do think that's something that I do think is good. And then our namesake, Francis Asbury, in the late 18th century, went with a group of clergy to meet with George Washington to try and get him to pass abolition. And while they didn't succeed, it was shortly after that meeting that George Washington changed his will to free his slaves upon his death. Not that that's enough, but it's something. So if I told you, I wish I had a clearer sense of that piece of our history, and the truth is I just don't. I would just say it's pretty humbling to look down a list of hundreds of ministers who have come before and thousands of people who have come to make what it is that you are doing today possible. And I'm grateful for all those countless people, and especially the people whose names we don't know and who will never get told, and the stories that helped make things happen. One of the stories that I have recently learned was about, and this relates to the previous question, but it's later in the civil rights movement, that members of this congregation discovered in the 1960s that African Americans in town were not able to get loans from a particular bank for a home loan. They weren't able to take mortgages. And so members of Asbury First got together and en masse withdrew all of their money, all of their accounts from this bank, and were able to, in the end, get the bank to reverse its policy. And I think just remembering that there's power in numbers, and that there's that we can make a difference, I think matters even for today. I mean, literally today, as we all awoke to news of a mass shooting in Rochester, to say, part of what a church has to be and often fails to do is to speak about what's going on within the world and try to make a difference within it. And not that it does it perfectly, but if it's not trying at least to speak into those, I'm not sure that it's doing its job, nor do I think it's worth existing for another 200 years. So my prayer for 200 years from now is that we continue to be the church that does something and that makes a difference in the world, that matters in the community. The live stream, you can get to our live stream through our website. Let me see if I can just send it to everybody through asburyfirst.org. And you're welcome. And we're open every Sunday, not just tomorrow, but you're welcome to join us. What we're going to do tomorrow, the service is at 11 a.m. And so that's when the official service always is for us, or at least in this strange time of COVID. Everything's virtual right now. But we're going to start at 10 o'clock with some remembrances. People have shared 30-second videos about what the church has meant to them. And so starting at 10, we're going to start showing those. And then 11 o'clock, we'll kick off the service. You can also watch them on our archive if you're not able to get there, or you're not up in time or something. But anybody's welcome, even the Presbyterians. Yeah.
Do we have any final questions? I'll take that as a no. Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Reverend Cady. Thank you for a wonderful talk today. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad we could give you a venue for this weekend.
Well, thanks for putting it together and asking us.
Absolutely.
I'm glad we met that one day in the local history division.
Yeah, thank you for your help.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
And I think Jerry might have been there as well, if I'm not mistaken, but maybe. No. Yeah. No. No. Okay. Somebody was there. Yeah. But thank you. Appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
All right.